Good morning and welcome. We are back in room 303, and our discussion project now for the hour in Senior English 8 is to work with two poems that we will qualify as poems of the Renaissance. Now, when we use this term Renaissance, just to remind ourselves, we are talking about that time in history, roughly 1600. That time in history, especially in British Renaissance history, when you've got tremendous energy going in the direction of the new, the modern. And yet, the Renaissance, the word itself means a rediscovery, or a return to. A return to what? A very Promethean kind of view of life. What is Promethean? Prometheus, you'll remember, is the cat who gives fire, right, to humans, and for that is punished by King God Zeus, is told by King God Zeus, no, don't do it, and he said, don't tell me what to do. Then Prometheus crucifies him on a rock, has this large eagle come and eat out his heart every day, and Prometheus does what? Apologizes to Zeus and says, please forgive me. No. Prometheus shouts the F word at Zeus and says, I did it, I do it again, I do it 1,000 times. Now that story, and others like it, are discovered during the time period that we call the Renaissance, and fascinated with a story like that. How can a culture produce a story like that, especially after the 1,000 years of what we will call the Dark Ages, time of the Renaissance, we'll apply that term, right? That is to say, the story of Job, which is the story of 1,000 years of the Dark Ages, a gentleman who, unlike Prometheus, will not fight against deity, but will acquiesce, accept this is the way it must be. The Renaissance then will produce some very radical ideas. That's the first thing I would recommend that you write down. Of course, you already know this, because when you were a freshman, you studied Shakespeare's classic Romeo and Juliet, which is, of course, a story about two young people who say, don't tell me what to do. Of course, the story, we should point out, does end somewhat tragically. The two young people die. Which might suggest that Shakespeare's a little bit more conservative than sometimes we want to give him credit. In other words, when kids start making their own decisions, not always a good idea, not always a good thing. And yet, Shakespeare himself, we could argue, really is a Promethean writer. In other words, he is going to construct characters and settings and situations that the church is going to find abhorrent. There's a reason why they keep shutting down his Globe Theater. Okay? If you'll think about it, it makes sense. Romeo and Juliet again. Yes, Romeo and Juliet decide to hook up, but they do it the legal way. They get married. Who marries them? Oh yeah, an official from the church, Friar Lawrence. Which suggests already that there's a movement afoot that even conservative friars are starting to play around the edges with, quote-unquote, the rules. Well, what are those rules about love? Very simple. You're born. Somebody decides for you who you will love. It's called an arranged marriage, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with sex. This is always fascinating to my students today. Marriage has absolutely nothing to do with sex. Well, I say absolutely nothing. Obviously, there's a bit of thinking about it. But the bottom line is, it's not about sex. Are you ready for this? It's often not even about love. Well, dude, what's it about? Money. I'm just going to use the term politics. That is to say, Romeo and Juliet. The first time we hear about Juliet, we don't see Juliet. We hear about Juliet through a conversation with her father and a man who is at least probably 20 years older than Juliet, Paris, who wants to marry Juliet. Interestingly, it's Juliet's dad who says, why don't you at least meet her and get to know her? Obviously, this marriage can't have anything to do with love or sex. It's got, he's never even seen her. She's never seen him. Later, just a little bit later, Mama's all excited. Juliet, hurrah, your dad, he's got you, you're gonna get hitched, it's gonna be great. Do you think you can, marry Paris? Juliet's answer is interesting. I look to like if looking like he move. In other words, what's he look like? She's never seen him. This is the way it works. And then, the Renaissance, where you will have the It's in Romeo and Juliet again. Wait a minute. So much is lost on us when we're stupid freshmen. Why is that such a radical moment? When Romeo is at the party and he sees the girl for the first time. What we'll call love at first sight. Although some of us will probably call it as lust at first sight. But love at first sight. And he sees her for the very first time. What's so radical about that whole project? What's so radical about that paradigm? Because they will decide about the rules. I got no interest. Very Promethean. In other words, they meet. He sneaks into her backyard. They have a conversation. She walks away from him and he says, "Wilt thou leave me so unsatisfied tonight?" And she looks back at him and says, "Well, what satisfaction canst thou have tonight?" Duh. Modern readers will go, duh. Of course, Shakespeare's audience understood what she was asking, because they ain't no way she's going to sleep with him, being who she is, especially. And then turn around and ever be eligible for an arranged marriage. She will be what's called, quote-unquote, spoiled. This whole thing of virginity has got nothing to do with sex. The need for a young lady to have virginity, it's got nothing to do with sex. It's got to do with the ability for the father to get the largest amount of money out of the union. It's got nothing to do with sex. It's got to do with the ability for the father to sell the daughter off. Well, today we still do it. When we have a marriage, the father will walk the intended bride down the man or woman who is conducting the ceremony will say, "Who gives this woman away?" What's that even mean? Well, she belongs to me, and now I'm giving my daughter to. See how that works? In other words, it's an exchange. For the first time in the Renaissance, we start to see this idea attacked. And the way it's attacked is going to be really fascinating. One way it's attacked is, of course, through the plays of Shakespeare. Remember in Hamlet, Daddy says to Ophelia, don't look at Hamlet, don't smell Hamlet, don't talk to Hamlet, no returning his tax, etc. Dad has all the power, and she says back to her father, "I will obey my lord." Back in the day, daughters did what they were told to do. And later in the play, Polonius will say, "This is why Hamlet's gone nuts, because my daughter refused any advances because she obeyed me because I told her not to." In other words, Dad has all the power. But there will be this movement in the Renaissance that says, maybe it's a better idea for a guy to convince the girl, "Hey, let's do this thing." That's going to be a very radical idea. And it's going to be best represented in a couple of British poems. Now, what's difficult for your anthology makers, the people who make these kinds of textbooks for high school students, what's difficult is that if you're going to talk about Renaissance poems, you got to talk about for sure two. One of them is called "To His Coy Mistress." I'm with you now on page 504 of your hymnal. A poem by Andrew Marvell. And then the other one is a Robert Herrick poem called "To the Virgins to Make Much of Time." Here's the problem. If you're going to talk about Renaissance poetry, you got to talk about these two poems. But if you talk about these two poems, then you inevitably have to accept what the premise behind the two poems actually is. And the minute you do that, well, you're kind of wading into some really dangerous territory for high school readers. Why? Well, because these two poems, two speakers, two male speakers, both of them having the same interests. Namely, using language to talk a girl into doing something she probably normally wouldn't do. Sounds like one or two high school senior boys with freshman girls in the first week of high school. Remember that one. And yet your textbook company's got a challenge. It can't come right out and say, these are the two greatest poems about a guy trying to tell a girl, let's hook up. You can't say that in a high school anthology. You get yourself in trouble. So what do? I'm with you on page 504. It's quite fascinating. How are you going to talk? Because you got to talk about these poems. You have to present these poems in an anthology on British Renaissance poetry. You have to. So how do you do it? Well, you talk about a concept or a word, a famous phrase. Are you there with me on page 504? That famous Latin phrase, carpe diem. Carpe diem. Now, for those of you who are Robin Williams fans, of course, tragically, we've recently lost him. His famous movie, Dead Poets Society, one I certainly would recommend to all viewers to watch. Yeah, I think this will be a movie that would very much entertain you. Carpe diem is going to be a very famous line from that poem. It means simply seize the day or seize the moment. Seize here means grab hold of. So in other words, act now. Don't wait until later. Carpe diem can become kind of like a mantra, a call to a certain way to live your life. In other words, don't sit back and wait for things to happen. Carpe diem. Let's go. Of course, ironically, they will put carpe diem. Well, just read it. Each poem in this grouping expresses a version of the carpe diem theme. Carpe diem, Latin for seize the day. The theme might be summed up as, time is fleeting, so act decisively and enjoy yourself. This theme has a classical origin. I hope you put this in your notes. Classical origin with the Roman poet Horace, being the first to use the phrase carpe diem. Of course, what's ironic is that they're going to introduce you to a philosophic concept by Horace called carpe diem, seize the day, to try to introduce you to a couple of poems where the guy is going to say to the girl, I think now is the time. Now let's talk for just a moment about language, shall we? Because if you know anything about high school guys-girl culture, you know that one of the really important things is the ways in which guys use language, talk, to get what they want from the girl. We'll not get into it. Okay? So in other words, I need you to hear what I'm about to say. We've got this thing that maybe can happen going forward. Let's talk. Back to Romeo and Juliet. Certain mature viewers of this play point out, for example, high school senior guys, when they watch this play again with me and they study with me, they will often say, you know what, when I was young, I was too stupid to really appreciate the fact Romeo is good. Oh no, he is really good. I mean, the first time he sees Juliet, he is good. So for example, how many guys do you know of could walk up to a girl that he does not know at the dance, and within 10 seconds, he already has the kiss at the dance? And the way he gets there is through language. He doesn't walk up and give her a kiss. He walks up to her and says words. He speaks words to her, and she goes, do it again. And so he says a few more words. He asks her if it's possible that lips can do what hands do. Pray. Of course, when you pray, you kiss your hands together. And she goes, yeah, I can do that. She puts her hand out. See, she's quick too. Yeah, we can kiss. Here, kiss hands. And he's like, oh, sweet, I get to touch her hand. But that's not enough. Now he's ready. Let lips do what hands do. And she goes, oh, you mean pray? That's what lips do. Lips pray. Sure, we can pray. And he's like, oh yeah, I like to pray. Let's pray. Yeah. Good one. In other words, he can use language to get what he wants. Well, what is it that he wants? Wilt thou leave me so unsatisfied? That's what he's going to ask her an hour later when he's in her backyard hanging out at her balcony. Remember? Okay. In other words, a guy has, back in the day, this is not true of guys today. Okay, guys today do not have an agenda. But back in the day, guys had an agenda, okay, in relationship to girls. And that agenda could be easily expressed through language. But poetic language, a language that says, you think we got a chance. Let's go to 2 poems to play this game. No pun intended. The first game with us, for us linguistic game, is To His Coy Mistress. Now, we got to start with the word coy. The word coy means what? Well, it means shy. It means not so confident or sure. Or, in the case of this poem, yeah, not so much. In other words, do you remember that poem we did with Sir Walter Raleigh? Now I'm doing a 3A observation. Right? Come live with me and be my love, and we shall all the pleasures prove, and all of that. Remember that? The shepherd who's going to ask the girl to come and live with him, even though he can't offer her anything. We're back to the same game all over again. Now you've got a guy trying to convince the girl, we need to do this thing now. Thing? What thing? Thing? What are you talking about? Thing? I don't even know what you're talking about. You'll remember that Ophelia plays a very similar game with Hamlet, and when Hamlet plops down next to Ophelia, not next to his mother, at the play within the play. Remember, Mama says to Hamlet, hey, come sit next to me. And he says, no, here's metal more attractive. Plops down next to Ophelia, and he looks up into her pretty little brown eyes and says, can I lie in your lap? It's not like she doesn't know what he's saying. And she goes, huh? Wait. No. He goes, I mean my head up on your lap. And he leans his head onto her knee. She's like, yes. And then he looks up at her again and says, did you think I meant country matters? Now, it's not like Ophelia doesn't know the game that Hamlet is playing. In other words, he uses language to say what he's thinking, but it's kind of hidden in a way. And she says, I think nothing, my lord. In other words, code language for, stop it, you're embarrassing me. Your ma's right there, and all these people are here. Would you stop it? Enough already. Here in a second, she's even going to say to him, you're merry. In other words, you've been drinking a little bit too much. But Hamlet will look back at her and say, it's a fair thought to lie between maid's legs. Whoa! There's a reason why the church will shut down the Globe Theater. Shakespeare, a Renaissance writer who is pushing at the bounds. Of course, we're going to see the same thing with Marvel. He's going to start out by making an argument that says, I wish I had more time. I wish we had more time. If I had enough time, well, how about this? Let's just go ahead now and work through the poem. All we're going to do is listen to a professional reader. As you listen to the poem, try to not, too many times roll your eyes, okay? To ask, really? Can this kind of language actually work? Can guys talk girls into doing something they normally wouldn't do? Yeah, we're familiar with that, huh? All right, here we go to the Coy Mistress. Here we go.
To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell.
Just follow the words.
But world enough in time, this coyness lady were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side shouldst rubies find. I by the tide of umber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood. And you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes and on thy forehead gaze. 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest. An age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. For, lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at lower rate. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie, deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. Then worms shall try that long-preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. The graves a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may, and now, like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour, than languish in his slow-chapped power. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rough strife, thorough the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet will we make him run.
All right. So let's take a look now and exegete this poem very briefly. I think it's fairly self-evident, given the background information that I gave to you, that some of you will go, oh, okay. First of all, notice that the poem is constructed in a series of stanzas that almost work like paragraphs. Do you see this? Where the first stanza will end, notice, at line 20, right? And so we're going to hear an argument that's made in 3 parts. So you want to write this down in your notes at level 1 this way. 3-part argument. Notice part 1 is the first 20 lines. And basically, what does he say? He says, had we world enough and time. If I had enough time, dude, I would take 1,000 years and just study and worship your eyes. And another 1,000 years to study and worship your breasts. And then another 1,000 for all the other body parts. And right. It kind of makes you go, of course, you can hear, you can see the girl rolling her eyes like, A guy will say anything, right? Then there's, however, the but. But I wish I had all this time so that I could, in other words, I wish I had a lot of time to take this nice and slow. But, I'm at line 21 on page 507. But at my back, I always hear the second use of time. Did you notice this? Time's winged chariot hurrying near. And yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. What's his argument? Can you put it in your own words? What's the argument that he makes? I wish we could take a really long time to work through this nice and slow. But I ain't got a lot of, and you ain't got a lot of, we're back to the T word of the opening lines, huh? We don't got a lot of time. Why don't we have a lot of time? Well, now I'm on to page 508. We don't have a lot of time because the worms are coming. Worms? Worms? What worms? Well, the maggots that eat you when, of course, you're dead and buried in your grave. Notice how he says it. He says, worms shall try that long-preserved virginity. This, of course, will tell us what it is that really is the subject of his conquest. By the way, notice the M word doesn't get used in this poem. He doesn't say, will you marry me? He says, let's take care of this virginity thing right now. In other words, the only thing that's going to get your virginity, if you don't give it up to me, are worms when you're dead lying in your grave, which is going to be really sad for you. Boo-hoo for you. Keep reading. Notice he says, the long-preserved virginity and your quaint honor. What does honor mean? Of course, that whole thing of what satisfaction canst thou have tonight is what Juliet asked Romeo, right? Notice he says, the grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. In other words, we only got now. You're young, but not for long. Now, therefore, notice how this poem moves from speculation, if only I had more time, to an observation about time as being, yeah, we don't got a lot of it, to now. Now, let's get to this project now. And then, notice how radical. I have students that say, whoa, this is kind of a dangerous poem even today. Notice the verbs of the last stanza, the action words. And notice how they all have in common something quite fascinating. Take a look at how he says it. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, in other words, you're young. You're young. And notice he says, while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires. In other words, he says, you want this as much as I want this. Okay. Now, second time of the use now. Now let us sport us while we may. Sport? Oh, so he's asking her to go shoot hoops at the park. Yay, sport. Well, this is interesting. And for those of you that haven't done it, a bit of research into the history of the word sport would open your eyes and make you smile the next time somebody asks, are you going out for a sport? Because you don't have professional sport teams in 1600. No. Nobody plays club basketball or soccer or volleyball in 1600. No. Nobody even knows the word sport is someday going to mean that thing that we turn on ESPN to watch. Not even kind of. Well, then what are we talking about with sport? Right. Now we're back to Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. What satisfaction canst thou have tonight? Notice what he says, though, and he uses a very interesting comparison using like or as. Oh, what's that called? A comparison using like or as. What do we call that? A simile. Good. So we're going to write this down. This is one of the more interesting similes. Watch this one. Some of you will not forget this one for a while. He says, and let us sport while we may. In other words, we got the time. And now like amorous birds of prey. Whoa, what does that mean? Amorous? Oh, related to love. Amorous birds of prey? Notice the word prey here doesn't mean one of these. I pray. No. Prey here means what? What bird is he talking about? He's talking about eagles. For those of you who don't know, the way eagles mate is quite fascinating. They will fly up into the air very high. They will slam together. For those of you that haven't seen this, Google it on YouTube. It's remarkable. They will slam together way up high. Of course, while they're copulating, they can't fly. Their wings can't fly. So as they slam together, they fall towards the earth to copulate. It's the only way they can do it. And then at the last second, right before they hit the ground, they separate and fly away. Again, if you haven't seen this, it's an amazing thing to watch. This is the way birds of prey copulate. That's the word picture. That's the simile that he uses. In other words, not only let us sport, but let's sport like eagles do. Like I said, I have students that go, this isn't a high school anthology? No. This is all about carpe diem. Horace's important philosophic idea about seize the day. Yes, seize as in grab hold of. Well, look at the verbs from here on out. Notice, like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time. Look at the verb. Devour. To eat up, but eat like really hard, right? Devour, I want to devour. Then languish in his slow chapped power. Let us roll, notice the verbs, all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. In other words, we can't slow down time, but we can certainly enjoy the time we've got. Let's go. Oh. Now, as if this kind of idea isn't totally lost on you, you can turn the page from 509 to 510 and meet the Robert Herrick poem, which is almost always paired with this poem for reasons that are fairly self-evident. First of all, let's point out the S in the title. What do you mean the S in the title? Notice, this is not to the virgin to make much of time, which would sound right. Notice it wasn't mistresses, it was to his coy mistress. One, right? Notice here it's virgins. To the virgins to make much of time. Gee, I wonder what this poem could be about. Like, the term virgin, we should point out, the term virgin just simply means unused or new. We equate the term virgins and virginity with sex. But by definition, one needn't do that. We can, for example, talk about virgin lands, which means lands that have not been in any way used. We can talk about a brand new vehicle as a virgin vehicle. It happens all the time. And in Shakespeare's day, the word virgin, in fact, often meant that very thing, just brand new. It didn't mean anything related to sex. And then Herrick and others are going to write a poem like this one. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying, and this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. I got some readers that go, this isn't a high school anthology. Wait, we're not done. The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, the higher he's a-getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. That age is best which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent, the worse and worse times still succeed the former. Then be not coy, there's that word again. Be not coy, but use your time, and while you may, go marry. For having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. Now you've got to be a pretty dull reader to move from Marvel's To His Coy Mistress to this poem and not have some sense about why these two poems are, again, joined together. I almost used the verb marry. Of course, again, we go back to the way your textbook has handled these two poems to say, this is all about carpe diem, seize the day. For example, here you are in your senior year, you only have a few more days left. Let's really try and use all of our time to learn new things academically. That's carpe diem, that's what it means. In other words, use your time wisely. Is that what these two poems are about? Well, yeah, I suppose if you want to talk about knowledge as being sexual knowledge, because that's obviously what's going on here. Notice the word picture that gets used for this poem. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. In other words, oh, this is great. This is a poem about going out and picking flowers. Let's all go pick flowers together. Yay! Which could make sense except for the title. Oh, yeah. In other words, Herrick plays a very interesting poetic game where he gives us a word picture about picking flowers. But once you've read the title, you go, oh. We're not talking about flower picking, we're talking about, and again, we're back to Juliet's question to Romeo. What satisfaction canst thou have tonight? Whoa. Now again, this is radical for 1600. Now, in a culture that you live in, where it's fairly self-evident that young people can make decisions about who they sleep with all the time in their own way and in their own time, a poem like this can seem a little less than radical. But we are in a different time. Notice the argument that he makes here. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. Why? Uh-oh, we're back to the T word again. The argument is, we don't have a lot of time. You're getting older, I'm getting older. Tomorrow, he says, will be dying, because the flower only blooms for a short period of time. The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, getting higher. In other words, the day is almost over. The sooner will his race be run, the nearer he's to setting. In other words, life can be seen as only a single day. Let's go, let's go, let's go. Notice this sense of urgency. We should point out, in both of these poems, does the girl ever talk? That much. Zero. Right? What do you imagine the girl is doing in both these poems? Some have said rolling her eyes. Others have said maybe trying to get up and walk away. Others have said, yeah, maybe you're right. Look at the third stanza. And then, of course, hello, we're clearly not talking about flowers anymore by the third stanza. That age is best, which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer. But being spent the worst and worst, times still succeed the former. In other words, the argument is, you might as well enjoy things when you're young, because once you get old, you don't enjoy anything. It's kind of a downer to get old, to grow old. Then be not coy, we're again back to that word, right? Coy, don't be shy. But use your time, and while you may, go, there's the word marry, right? But the word marry here, of course, is going to be not let's get married, but what? Let's have a good time, right? Let's have a good time. Go marry. For having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. Which means what? Well, you've got basically one good shot at this. Let's do that one good shot with me. Because let's just not waste your time here. Come on. Let's go. But what's fascinating is that this poem, in its title, has an S. Jot down in your notes why that's significant. There's an S behind the word virgin. To the virgins to make much of time. What's his point here? Well, some have argued that maybe he's interested in more than one girl. But we should point out that probably the argument here is, let's start to think differently about this whole virginity thing. In other words, let's talk about the whole group of women who have decided they're going to wait for Daddy to make up his mind about who it is they will marry. In other words, make up your own mind in your own time. Very Promethean. Well, when you look at a couple of poems like this, you can go, wow, the Renaissance was a pretty radical time for its day. Some will argue, still a fairly radical suggestion. Of course, do you think it works? That's ultimately the question. Are girls smarter than guys talking with this kind of language? Well, I don't know.